Hi there, this is Solitaire Ronan from Solitaire Ronan Films, and welcome to another episode of In the Frame. Today I'm going to talk about the Harry Palmer films of the 60s, starring Michael Caine, who just happened to be in this wonderful box set by Imprint. This is by number 75, 76 and 77. This is the Ipcress File, Funeral in Berlin, and Billion Dollar Brain. This is a beautiful little box by Imprint. I do kind of like the box sets by Imprint because they have the nice interior and they're solid. So they come in their each little case. And just the artwork in the inside. For each film, I'll get into the extras in a bit. There's the Funeral in Berlin from 66. Yeah, these three films were made in 3 years. Billion Dollar Brain. So these are based on books by Len Deighton. The first one, the Ipcress File, was published in 1962. Deighton kind of just fell into being a best-selling novelist. He'd written the Ipcress File as a script initially, and then put it in a drawer while he was on holiday, and it sat there, and then he ended up writing it as a novel, and it has been out of print since. The films were produced by Harry Saltzman, who was involved with Cubby Broccoli and produced the James Bond films that had just started a few years earlier than the Ipcress File in 1965. Michael Caine had been a working actor for about 11 years. He was 30, I think, when he got the part in Zulu. That led to him getting the Harry Palmer role, even though in the books Harry Palmer didn't have a name. He was the unnamed spy. I'm a Philistine, as you all know, and I haven't read the books. And the name Harry Palmer came up in conversation with Michael Caine and Harry Saltzman to think of the most ordinary name they could, and Palmer was the name of a really boring boy Michael Caine knew at school, and they just came up with Harry Palmer. This is kind of not an anti-Bond. It's a slightly more working class, normal civil servant who happens to be in the spy racket, but there's lots of forms to be filled in. There's lots of paperwork and not much excitement. They carry a gun, but they hardly ever use it. So in that respect, the Harry Palmer films are closer to the John le Carre, which also came out in 1965, The Spy Came In From the Cold, and much more the kind of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy milieu, the kind of grittiness, and less like this. Well, put it this way, 2 of the films are more like this, and 1 of the films is more like this, but we'll get to that at some point. So the first film was directed by Sidney J. Furie, who sadly is probably most famous for directing Superman 4, but he's done lots of strange films, direct-to-DVD, Dolph Lundgren action films, a few Iron Eagle sequels. We did The Entity, the original Appaloosa, and apparently first day on the set, when Michael Caine turned up, Sidney Furie burned the script, because that's what he thought of it. So they somehow worked their way into making an absolutely wonderful film, the Ipcress File, and creating somewhat of an iconic character. We're introduced to Harry Palmer as he wakes up and makes coffee, very mundane and ordinary. He goes to a stakeout where, and after a while, another man comes in and says his boss wants to see him. A Colonel Ross, played in all 3 films by Guy Dolman, who looks a lot like Richard Todd but isn't Richard Todd. And he tells Palmer that he's transferring him to the wonderful Nigel Green's unit. Always the underused Nigel Green, but he's absolutely fantastic in this, as he is in just about everything he ever did. Because a scientist has went missing, and the member of MI5 who was looking after him wound up dead. So Harry Palmer is his job is to try and find the trail that went cold, with other colleagues, including the wonderful Gordon Jackson from Upstairs, Downstairs and The Professionals fame, playing a Scottish character called Jock. And there's also a female character that Harry cooks dinner for, which apparently upset the producers, because they were worried people might think that Harry Palmer was a homosexual because he was cooking dinner, but he was cooking dinner for a woman. And also they were a bit concerned about Michael Caine wearing glasses originally, because Sean Connery doesn't wear glasses as Bond. But again, Harry Palmer is not James Bond. And we have lots of intrigue. The body count gets higher. I'm not going to go into the plot specifics, because it's much better as an audience to not know what's going on. And that's the thing about these, well, certainly the first 2 of the films, which might come as a bit of a shock to modern audiences, because not a lot is explained. You're actually supposed to pay attention to what's going on, and then it comes down to who is on what side. Caine delivers a fairly sardonic performance. His character is a bit of a troublemaker. The only kind of background we have in him was after the war he was in Berlin and got up to some shady business, got into trouble, and is pretty much over Colonel Ross's barrel. There's a wonderful scene in the supermarket where they're talking about mushrooms, but they're not really talking about mushrooms. It's an absolutely fantastic film. It was shot by Otto Heller, who did the first 2, was going to do the third one, but because that one was shot in Finland, they were worried about his health, and he didn't want to take a medical, so he didn't get to shoot the third one. The set design was Ken Adam, who's probably more famous for doing production design for Kubrick. It's just a wonderful film that I would much rather watch than Bond films, but that's just me. This film, I think, is a 10 out of 10. It's absolutely fantastic. It's a wonderful film. It's just a wonderful film that I would much rather watch than Bond films, but that's just me. This film, I think, is a 10 out of 10. It's absolutely fantastic. It's a wonderful film that I would much rather watch than Bond films, but that's just me. released by Imprint is absolutely loaded. It's a 1080 scan from, sorry, it's a 1080 master from a restored 2K scan, which is similar to the network Blu-ray. I was going to include a free boutique label battle with the network release of the Ipcress File, but I've forgotten to pull it out. There's a commentary by director Sidney J. Furie and editor Peter Hunt from 1999, which is on the network Blu-ray as well. There's a 2020 commentary by film historian Troy Howarth and film historian filmmaker Daniel Kremer, who is the only person to write a book on Sidney J. Furie. There's a 2006 interview with Michael Caine about Harry Palmer. There's a 2006 interview with Ken Adam. There's a locations report from 2021 with Richard Dacre around London. And if you have some British Studio Canal Vintage Classics films, he does the same thing for some of those releases as well. Like It Always Rains on Sunday, he goes around the London streets with the locations, which is quite interesting. We have Through the Keyhole, interview with second assistant director Dennis Johnson Jr. from 2021. And then Counting the Cash, we have an interview with assistant production accountant Morris Landsberger from 2021, and we have the opening scenes without the titles as well and trailers. So Ipcress File is probably the best out of the three films, and stacked with extras. And then we have Funeral in Berlin, which is almost just as much fun as the first one, I think. It's maybe slightly down a little bit, but it's still a wonderful film. Again, it's the year after we're introduced to Harry Palmer. He has a bit more confidence. He get paid a bit more extra after the first film, and he gets sent to Berlin because there's a Russian colonel who may want to defect, and he's to find out how to get him out of East Berlin to West Berlin. But as in the case with all these spy nonsense, that's not quite what's going on. Palmer meets an old friend, so you do have this idea that in between the Ipcress File and Funeral in Berlin, he has had several missions around Europe. He has built up his reputation. People, know of him. People have heard of him, and he helped this guy out of a tight jam. And he meets this woman who's obviously trying to ensnare him. And she turns out to be an Israeli agent. So you have a storyline about the Israelis trying to find a Nazi, who I think was at Belsen, I think is the concentration camp that's mentioned. You have papers that people are interested in. You have the ingenious way of getting out of East Berlin to West Berlin. The clues in the title. It's pretty much I've completely forgotten what I was going to say. This one was directed by Guy Hamilton, who of course directed some James Bond films. It does kind of lack the kind of visual flair of the Ipcress File. I don't know whether it was a reaction to the script, but Sidney Furie in the first film uses a lot of Dutch angles. He shoots lots of things through telephone boxes, if you're old enough to remember telephone boxes. And there's always as if somebody's watching all the time, which gives it a really interesting look. He uses really interesting compositions and objects in the frame, whereas Guy Hamilton, who's done some Bond films, it's a much more standard kind of way of shooting a film, so it kind of lacks that kind of stylistic panache of the Ipcress File as well, which did kind of feel a bit 60s at the same time, whereas Funeral Berlin is much more traditional filmmaking as far as setups and compositions. It's still a lot of fun, and it's really, the first two really go very well. A couple of bits of trivia: the second assistant director was Peter Medak, who obviously would go on to have his own interesting career, and the assistant editor Roger Spottiswoode, who also would go on to edit and direct his own films. The extras on Funeral in Berlin, there's a commentary by Rob Mallows of the Dayton Dossier, that's from 2021. There's Fun in Berlin, an interview with the editor John Bloom from 2021, which is really interesting because Guy Hamilton walked off the film before it was completely edited. It was an argument over the music, I think. So Guy Hamilton actually left before the film was actually finished up. But as John Bloom, the editor, says, it wasn't really anything to finish off particularly. It was just to kind of put it all together. Afternoon Plus, which is an interview from Len Dayton from Thames Television from 1983, which is actually a really good interview. He talks about his views on his writing and politics and the film. It's really quite interesting. There's A Candid Caine, a self-portrait by Michael Caine, a television documentary from 1969. And there's also Michael Caine Breaking the Mold, which is a feature-length documentary from 1994. So again, the disc is absolutely packed. This one's just a 1080 transfer. But again, a really good, fun film. So then we get $1 Billion Brain, which bizarrely was directed by Ken Russell. This was certainly the biggest film he'd made at that point. He had made BBC films. A couple of years after this, he would make Women in Love, and he would go down his own path. Michael Caine said himself that Ken Russell wasn't really interested in making a film like this, but again, it's always an experience. But obviously he was destined to make films of a slightly different kind. This one was executive produced by Andrew de Toth, quite interestingly. So this is 1967, again, 3 films in 3 years. This one is more like a Bond. The first two are more down to earth and gritty and realistic and believable. $1 Billion Brain is a bit more tongue-in-cheek. I think everybody involved kind of knows what kind of film they're making, and it's not the same kind of film as the first two. It co-stars Carol Malden and Francois Dorlac, who, in a case of I wish I hadn't watched the extras, find out that she actually died before the film was released, because she was going to the airport in France to fly to London to do some post-sync stuff, and her car burst into flames and she was killed, which is a bit of a downer. The film itself takes place mostly in Finland, so lots of snow. Has Harry Palmer. We find Harry Palmer, and he's a private detective. He's out of MI5, and his place has been burgled, so he goes back and he finds Colonel Ross pouring cornflakes on the floor looking for something. begging him to come back to MI5, which he's not interested in doing. And then he gets a job to deliver this flask, which he finds out has eggs in it. What they contain, you'll have to watch the film to find out. And he goes to Helsinki to hand over this package and get paid. But when he goes to the contact, it's Francois Dorlac, and then she takes him to what he thinks is going to be a doctor of some kind, but it turns out to be Carl Malden, who again, they've had previous, so again, between Funeral in Berlin and $1 Billion Brain, you feel again his reputation, he's worked with more people and had dealings with more agencies and more people. And Carl Malden is working for this organisation, and this is the organisation that Colonel Ross and MI5 want him to infiltrate and stop, because it's run by a Texan oil magnate whose insignias and badges on his company look a lot like swastikas if you kind of squint a little bit. And the insignia on his badges look a lot like Nazi insignias, you know, the kind of eagle shape and stuff like that. And he has a supercomputer. The film was actually shot partly in Honeywell's facilities. In those days, the computers were the big tapes and took up an airplane hangar basically in size. But he is planning his $1 Billion Brain. He is planning to start an uprising in Latvia and pretty much go to war with Russia and start World War III essentially. And Harry Palmer has to kind of stop it. If it sounds like a Bond plot, it probably sounds like a Bond plot. Whereas the first two were grounded, this one is certainly not grounded. A returning character from Funeral Berlin turns up. Again, I'm not going to tell you who, because that would be spoiling it. And again, it's a bit messy in places. It could have been 10 minutes shorter. It's still a fun little film. It's an interesting piece in Ken Russell's career. And again, maybe that persuaded him these aren't the kind of films that I really want to make. But it's still a fun film. It's just not as good as the first two. The maniacal oil man is played by Ed Begley, who goes on super Patton mode once he gets his little military outfit. Ed Begley just goes full bore and is just absolutely wonderful as he's chewing scenery like you wouldn't believe. But watching it now in 2022, he's not that far off the truth of perhaps crazy people from Texas that want to rule the world. Yeah, it's a fun... This one is more kind of Saturday or Sunday afternoon, switch your brain off kind of film, whereas the first two are really tight, tense. Again, you have to pay attention to what's going on kind of films, whereas the third one's just kind of Sunday afternoon, have some fun for a couple hours. The extras on $1 Billion Brain, it's a 1080p transfer. There's a commentary by film historians Vic Pratt and Will Fowler from 2021. If you're familiar with releases from BFI and other boutique labels, Vic Pratt usually does some work on that, even though if you were one of the unlucky people who bought the Adventures films from Indicator, Vic Pratt actually stars in the homages to these films. The two short films, The Adventures of a Plumber from Outer Space. Yeah, Can You Keep Up With This, That and the Other for a Week, where I think Vic Pratt plays a plumber. That will actually give you a different view of Vic Pratt as opposed to the serious film historian that you see on other boutique label releases. There's an interview with Rob Mallows of the Dayton Dossier from 2021, just about Len Dayton and the Harry Palmer films. He did a commentary on Funeral in Berlin. And there is Photographing Spies, an interview with cinematographer Billy Williams from 2021, and Billion Dollar Frame, an interview with associate director Willie Kempland from 2021. And there's an interesting little piece from this week from 1969, which is an excerpt of Michael Caine discussing the British film industry with producer Michael Deeney. They're having a game of table football and being asked questions of the British film industry. So that's an interesting little addition. So that's the imprint release of the 3 Harry Palmer films. Michael Caine did reprise the Harry Palmer character in the mid-90s. I don't know whether they were TV movies, but they weren't based on Len Dayton books, and I haven't seen them. And obviously ITV, not obviously, but ITV in the UK have recently done an Ipcress File mini-series, which again I haven't seen and I probably won't watch. So it's getting a reappraisal or a reimagining, even though it's just retro 60s stuff. So that is the Harry Palmer films of the 60s with Michael Caine, with this lovely Indicator imprint box set. Let's not start a civil war. I'd highly recommend it if you are interested in these films at all. I would highly recommend the box set. It's absolutely loaded with extras. I mean, the documentary, there's 2 documentaries on Michael Caine, but the one from 1994 especially, when he talks about his childhood and where he came from, and he was one of those actors in the same kind of class as Albert Finney and Peter O'Toole and Richard Harris and Terence Stamp. As Michael Caine said, he shared a flat with Terence Stamp, and he talks about how everybody around him became famous. Terence Stamp became famous. Apparently his hairdresser was Vidal Sassoon, who then became famous. Apparently Terence Stamp's brother or somebody stayed with him for a while and then came back one day and said, oh yeah, I'm going to be a music producer or a music manager. And he said, oh yeah, because we've just met this band in a bar and they're called The Who. So as Michael Caine says, it was a wild and crazy time in the 60s where pretty much everybody was becoming a star. And he said he was actually the last one of that group of actors who became stars. But he's done alright for himself, hasn't he? So thanks very much for watching this fairly rambling video about Harry Palmer. Hopefully you'll join me again for more In the Frames. You can let me know in the comments below what your favourite Harry Palmer film is. It might be one of the ones from the 90s. So hopefully you enjoyed the video and you'll join me again. This is Soldier On from Soldier On Films, saying farewell.